Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We'll get started as more people trickle in. I'm Joel Dodge, and I'm chair of the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter. We are thrilled to present today's discussion, the New York Housing Compact and the state of New York's housing debate. We are sponsoring this event along with our fellow lawyer chapters in Connecticut and Madison, Wisconsin. Thank you very much for co-sponsoring today's event with us. So New York has a housing shortage after decades of failing to sufficiently expand housing supply, despite rising rents and rising housing costs across the state. That has left more New Yorkers rent burdened and more unable to buy homes. And with the housing situation growing worse and worse here, Governor Hochul recently proposed a plan, which he called the New York Housing Compact, that would have added some 800,000 new housing units over the next decade. But that plan pretty quickly ran headlong into resistance from the state legislature, which ultimately, it looks like, probably killed it off during budget negotiations last week. So today we'll talk through why New York needed something like the Housing Compact, what that plan could have done, why it was rejected, and what comes next. And we have a true expert with us to talk through these issues today. Noah Kazis is a housing expert and professor at the University of Michigan School of Law. We'll talk to Noah and save time for your questions toward the end of the hour, so please submit them using the Zoom Q&A function at any time. So let's get started. Noah, before we dive into what happened in New York, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you wound up working on issues dealing with housing and exclusionary zoning?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having me, and thanks for sponsoring this event. It's really great to see ACS taking this on. I think it's an interesting intersection of law and policy with implications for a whole range of risk issues. So I've been working on housing since before I went to law school, when I was a reporter for a website called Streets Blog covering transportation issues. And if you start doing transportation, you quickly realize that where people live has a lot to do with how they get around. I started to get really into zoning with respect to parking minimums, and from there we're sort of off to the land use and arid races. But on these sort of questions of exclusionary zoning, that came about through work I was doing while in law school in the Community Economic Development Clinic, working to defend Connecticut's anti-exclusionary zoning statute, which, while certainly weak and something that advocates there have been working to build upon, is something. And New York, in contrast, has nothing of the sort. So after a few other things, including some time working for the city of New York in the law department, I was at the NYU Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy and wanted to write something about what would it look like for New York to take on exclusionary zoning? What can it learn from all the other states that have acted in this space? And at the time, that list was not as long as it is now. I mean, that even just a few years later, there's been so much action. So that's really the motive, was to say we've learned a lot from these other places, but New York is different, right? It's going to have its own permutation that fits. And, what can we say about what works, what doesn't, what translates, what doesn't?
Yeah, thanks for that. And maybe to start with, could you just define for us or tell us, when we hear about or talk about exclusionary zoning, what does that mean and why is it bad?
Yeah, I can't really answer that because there's no one definition of exclusionary zoning, because zoning regulates so many different things, and any zoning excludes something, right? It's saying what you can and can't do, what you can and can't build. So it's really a family of regulations, a constellation of things that are being unduly or inappropriately or unjustly restricted, right? So there's exclusionary zoning that prohibits apartments, and there's exclusionary zoning that says within the world of single family homes, you have to have big lots that mean you have to pay for a lot of land. There's zoning that ends up being exclusionary because it's about process, giving neighbors the power to decide what they want to be built and who they want to live near, and to abuse that discretion. There's zoning that excludes based on class and therefore race. There's zoning that excludes based on certain kinds of family. There's zoning that excludes for particular neighborhoods. There's zoning that excludes at the regional level as opposed to the neighborhood level. And all of those are things that we should care about. So when we're thinking about solutions, you have to remember the problem is incredibly multifaceted because we've been pursuing this kind of zoning strategy for basically a century at this point, and we're starting to walk it back over a few years, well, decades in some places, but years in other places. So there's a lot going on, a lot in the mix, but anything that's too restrictive that makes it hard to build enough housing, enough affordable housing, enough different kinds of housing, that set of problems coming together is what I'd call exclusionary zoning.
Got it. And so in your in the paper you did for the Furman Center, you sort of outlined 5 main categories of the harms of exclusionary zoning. Could you just run through some of those and then maybe we can unpack them?
Oh, sure. You'll have to tell me which categories I leave out as I go through it. But so one problem is about affordability, which is obviously top of mind for people in the New York metro area. That's partly just a supply and demand story. If you say you have to have an acre of land or 2 acres of land per house, you're not going to have as many houses. That means there's going to be just more bidding up of the price of homes in a sort of simple supply and demand story. Some of it is about types of housing, right? That it's cheaper to live in an apartment or a townhouse where you don't have to buy a yard when you buy a home or rent a yard when you rent a home. Some of it is about specific exclusions or barriers to building affordable housing. So that's one piece of it. There's a whole set of pieces that are sort of the macroeconomic harm of not letting people live where good jobs are. Again, New York State is a place where the economy has been booming, at least in sort of the pre-COVID 10 years, adding jobs, adding good jobs. And that's getting swallowed up by rents, and it's meaning people are moving to places like Houston or Nashville or Atlanta instead of New York. Which has some real macro harms for the national economy. I mean, in the trillions of dollars, economists think. There's harms about segregation and racial inequality, both in terms of who's able to access the gains from housing, but also in terms of just integration. There's good empirical research tying substantial, they're not totally clear exactly what percent, but pretty substantial amounts of the segregation we have in this country to restrictive land use controls. New York, not surprisingly, is either second or third most segregated region, depending on which measure you're looking at. There's harms about the environment, about sort of pushing growth out to the periphery and sprawl instead of building more transit or building in more sustainable multifamily forms. There's harms that involve sort of just choice, right? Like you want to live in an intergenerational household with an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, where a grandparent can age in place but have some privacy. There's a lot of laws in New York that tell you can't do that. There's harms related to disability access in terms of new development being ADA compliant. Old development obviously didn't have to be. If you don't allow new development, you're cutting off that important avenue of growth. I mean, there's just so many things going on.
Yeah, I think you got them all. On your point about segregation, racial and economic segregation, it seems like from what you put in your paper that that's perhaps not accidental, and that the origins of exclusionary zoning have some pretty ugly roots in the Jim Crow era and attempts to de facto segregate neighborhoods. Can you say a bit more about those that history around exclusionary zoning?
Yeah, I mean, zoning has so many historical strands that it's hard to sort of draw the causal stories, but it's undisputedly true that one of the things that was going on from the very birth of zoning was an intent to segregate according to, depending on the city you're in, race or sort of ethnicity and immigration status or class or family status. Right? If you go back to Euclid, the Supreme Court case that upholds zoning, you go to the district court. There's a quote where he says, "The result to be accomplished is to classify the population and segregate them according to their income or situation in life." Now, in Euclid at the time, they were more worried about immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, but in other places, they were worried about race in sort of a white and black sense. And in other places, they were worried about, sort of single people who did not fit a nuclear family. Zoning has really always been about preserving particular social orders, whether that's, Jewish immigrants in the garment district, or it's in some places zoning as we now see it really descended from efforts to do specifically racial zoning in places like Louisville or Baltimore. A lot of different elements. There's great research showing that the timing of zoning adoption or strict zoning adoption, I'm not sure, can be distinctly traced to when the Great Migration hits particular northern cities, just based on sort of random variation of train lines and things like that. You see a strengthening of zoning after restrictive covenants are ruled unconstitutional, right? Where communities that have this desire to segregate say, we lost one tool, let's use this other tool. And similarly, after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. So it is, there's a lot of intent to segregate, at least at the inception, and then these are the rules that just keep on thereafter.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it seems like we'll get to New York in a second, but outside of New York, it seems like some other states have realized that zoning is a problem and have taken some policy actions to counterbalance it, right? So can you tell us a bit about what other states, neighboring states, and elsewhere in the country have done that has been effective?
Yeah, well, let me start with a story that I think adds to the question, which is New York realized it too. In 1968, 69, immediately after Martin Luther King was assassinated, as the state's response, the governor put forward a plan to create the Urban Development Corporation, UDC, which had, among other things, the power to override zoning and build affordable housing. It was explicitly pitched as a civil rights measure and was passed. They sort of came up with their first plan to do this in Westchester, and Westchester erupted into protests. The power was pretty swiftly repealed, and that's been that in New York. So I don't want to suggest this is some sort of something New York hasn't realized, right? New York absolutely realized the stakes of it, and they did something about it, and then they didn't like what they did, also understanding the stakes of it. Just to push back on the framing of the question, and I think to enrich it, but to the meat of it, what have other states done? There's been so much. There's been a lot that's been ineffective, and there's a lot that's looking effective, and it has been effective. So probably the most important one is the Mount Laurel Doctrine that comes out of the New Jersey Supreme Court, and then gets codified into statute and then gets returned to the court. It's like quite a saga. But we're talking about tens of thousands of units of housing built over decades in largely exclusionary suburbs. That doctrine requires that every jurisdiction provide a fair share of the region's affordable housing needs as determined in sort of a town by town basis, and has pretty strict enforcement procedures. There's a weaker statutory version of that called 40B in Massachusetts, also dating back sort of 1969, says if you haven't hit 10% of your housing stock being affordable, developers who want to build affordable housing can come in, ignore local zoning, and there's still a process by which the town gets to weigh in, appeals go to the state, but the burdens are shifted in a way that's very favorable, somewhat favorable to developers. There's a process out of California called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. It basically is a planning process. A share of housing need is allocated to each local government, who then has to say, here's how we're going to do it. Here's our plan. With some enforcement mechanisms that until recently were extremely weak. There's research basically saying the difference between having a compliant RHNA plan and a non-compliant RHNA plan is statistically zero. That said, California legislature knew what was going wrong and finally had the votes to fix it. They're in a new RHNA cycle, and preliminary research coming out of a series sponsored by the Furman Center is showing pretty substantial returns from that. So there's sort of a way to make that really work. There's more direct overrides, things like California's requirements to allow accessory dwelling units and say, like, look, if it has these setbacks and this height and this square footage, you just have to allow it, period. Similar things in California that were just passed allowing multifamily development on commercial corridors. There's laws targeting more what people call missing middle, 2 to 4 unit sort of duplex type development that have been broadly legalized at the state level in states as diverse as California, but also Maine or Oregon. Massachusetts has a new law that I think is very exciting, a transit-oriented development law. It's being implemented right now, so we'll see how well it works. It basically says, look, if you're near transit, here's the number you have to hit for what your zoning allows, this many units over this big a space. You tell us how you want to do it. You want 1 big building, you want 3 medium buildings, you want 10 small buildings, we're fine with any of it. You tell us how to get there. And then there's states that have taken a somewhat lighter touch, like Utah, but again, red state, not on the coasts, that have said, here's 10 things you can do. Pick 3 of them. Only 3 will do, but you got to do something.
Yeah.
So I'm leaving out stuff too. I mean, there's just been an explosion of activity. So there's a lot of strategies. A lot are showing dividends. It's a little early to say for sort of the explosion of activity that's happened over the last, say, 5 years.
Got it. And since we are talking to a group of lawyers, I figured I'd highlight that in some states, towns can actually be sued over restrictive zoning, essentially for like, discriminating against certain forms of housing. Is that right?
Yes, there are both states that have that as a matter of their constitutions. That's the origins of the Mount Laurel Doctrine in New Jersey, and there are states that have it as a matter of statute. The statutes and constitutional provisions outside New Jersey have tended to be quite weak, but not dead letters. New York has one of these doctrines. It's called the Berenson Doctrine. It goes back to the 70s. It's unconstitutional in New York for a local government to use its zoning power without taking into account the regional need for housing, because it's the state's zoning power at the end of the day. It's just delegated to local governments. So local governments can't use it in a way that is purely selfish. That, for remedial reasons, has done very, very little. But an interesting question for a group of lawyers is whether that still has to be true. One of the things that made that weak is a sense that you're balancing local needs with regional needs, but regional needs have increased dramatically since the 70s and 80s when the big cases were decided. So is there a way to reboot that doctrine for a new era? I kind of think there is if you can find the right plaintiff.
That's really interesting. And I'd be curious to know if there's any work being done to re-enliven or reinvigorate that doctrine to meet the scale of the housing crisis here today.
Yeah, I haven't seen the lawsuit yet, but I'm sure that it's something people are thinking about because as the legislature doesn't act, one good way to remind them the stakes and remind them they can't just sit back is to force their hands in court.
Yeah, especially as there are new shifts in the New York State Court of Appeals.
Yeah.
So to turn to New York now in earnest, could you just say a bit about the scope of the problem, how bad the housing situation is in New York?
Very bad, very, very bad, right? So in that report, what we did, and so this data is a few years out of date, obviously housing markets have changed in some wonky ways in the wake of COVID, but looking at sort of that pre-COVID period, one thing we did is we looked at a common measure of sort of housing production, which is building permits per capita. We basically looked at every suburban county in the Northeast Corridor and in the Bay Area and in Southern California, thinking those are the places that are widely understood, correctly understood to be the most restrictively zoned places, at least restrictively zoned relative to demand. Right? We don't really care if there's restrictive zoning in a place that's shrinking really fast because it doesn't come up. 4 of the 5 worst counties of that list are Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, and Putnam. 4 out of the bottom 5 of a list of like 50 counties or something. Right. So we're not talking about comparing New York to the Sun Belt. We're talking about comparing it to like Greater Boston or the Bay Area, like places that are famous among land use types for being quite restrictive. New York City, compared to other big cities, is not literally worst of the worst, the way the New York suburbs are, but it is much, much, much closer to the bottom than the top. And again, New York City's economy is booming. It's not that we're not building because people don't want to live in New York. There are great jobs with high wages, there are good schools, there's a best in the country transit system to build around. The prices obviously suggest that the demand is there. Another way to come at it is there's different projects that have tried to survey local governments' land use regulations. Either ask them for information directly, or a new project is trying to use machine learning to read them online. If you take the survey method or the machine learning method, you either get New York City is the first most restrictively zoned place in the country, or the second most restrictively zoned in the country. One of those teams is out of Wharton and is a bunch of really great economists. The other is a team that includes Matthew Desmond, who were evicted and a new poverty. So yeah, it's really bad.
It's really bad. And it seems like things kind of came to a head and reached a level where some policymakers felt like they had to respond in the last year or two. And so Governor Hochul comes out with this housing compact proposal that was promised to create some 800,000 new units of housing. What was in the proposal? It seemed like she was kind of picking from some of the other state policies that you outlined and adapting them for New York. But what was her proposal to fix or at least alleviate the housing problem here in the state?
Yeah, there were two main components on the land use side, putting aside things like tax incentives and whatnot. So one of them is a transit-oriented development measure that's pretty similar to what I mentioned in Massachusetts. So what it would have said was within a certain radius, half a mile around transit stations, cities and towns and villages had to come up with a scheme for how they were going to hit a certain density. In the closer in suburbs, that was 50 dwelling units per acre. At the furthest edges of the downstate transit system, it was 15 units per acre. And again, they could say, we want to put it all on this side of the transit station. We could put it all on that side. We want bigger buildings. We want broader density. So that's one piece of it. And then the second was a municipality by municipality target. In upstate, it was 1%, and downstate it was 3% for how much the housing stock had to grow. And if you didn't hit that target over a 3-year period, one of two things would happen. One is that you could pass a set of 5 policies they laid out would be an alternative way of complying, right? So you'd have to change your land use policies. And the other is that thered be what's called a builder's remedy, which means a developer could come in, sort of like I mentioned earlier in some other states. A developer come and say, we want to build this for a mixed income housing project. And the local government could really only say no if there was a kind of compelling evidence-based health and safety type reason. Right? So you couldn't say, we don't like it, it's too tall. You could say that's going to, overload our sewer system. Yeah, and here's the proof, something like that. Details are more complicated, obviously.
Sure. And what types of housing, were we talking about being built here? Is it apartments, townhouses, starter homes, all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, both of those programs by design give the keys to local governments to answer that question, right? On the transit-oriented development, they can allocate the zoning how they want. On the target, they can do anything they want to hit 3%, or they could have. Then if they didn't hit that, they had sort of 5 choices for how they could rewrite their own zoning with respect to these state harbors. And only then would developers sort of have the right to come in. Those developers, because they're building mixed income projects, those would probably be apartment buildings. But for anything else, right, it's up to the local governments to figure out which version of density they wanted. Unlike some other states, the Hochul proposal was really letting local governments start with control. So I think that the way the numbers work, some apartments could be some townhouses, could be small lot, single home, family homes. There's a lot of ways to make the math work, probably including some apartments, at least in the closer in areas. But this was a very choose your own adventure kind of program.
Right. Yeah, it had built-in flexibility. Did the compact itself explicitly ensure any degree of affordable housing, or what was its theory of affordability, I guess?
Yes, so I would say it was more focused on aggregate supply than on building specifically affordable units, but not exclusively. Right, so one theory of affordability is we just don't have enough supply. We need to build more supply, and that's going to ease the pressure on the entire market. It's going to ease the pressure for people who are just buying market rate, and it's going to make our subsidy dollars, which New York really leads on, stretch further. Right, that voucher can go further if you have to hit this rent instead of this rent. Ditto for the project-based subsidy. So that's one piece of it. The TOD piece did not have an explicit affordability requirement. I suspect that was something that would have to be ironed out if this was going to pass, right? Must you include affordable units? May you mandate affordable units as a local government? But they were silent on that. And then on the targets, the 1 or 3%, there were two places affordability came in. So one is for places that didn't hit their target, that builder's remedy was for mixed income housing. So that had a certain percentage of affordable units. So the remedy for not building enough housing is to loosen up the production of affordable housing. And the other piece of it was that in hitting that 3% or 1% target, they counted affordable units extra. So if you were building affordable units, you didn't have to build as much total. So affordability was built in, but it was more focused as a program on total supply.
Got it. So after the governor rolled out her housing compact plan, it was pretty immediately controversial, especially in the New York City suburbs. I was wondering what struck you as most noteworthy about the public and political response to the housing plan here in New York?
Well, one thing that I was struck by is actually that I wouldn't call it as immediate as maybe it was the previous year. So she had a less ambitious and less fully fleshed out set of housing proposals, but pretty similar in their broadest strokes a year before. And that really was, proposal comes out, it is instantly torpedoed, the ship goes down. And that's not what I think the pattern was here. I think there was a decent period of time where the legislature was holding back, taking temperatures, considering. The opposition did mount, and they did give into that opposition, especially from the suburbs. But I don't think it was a done deal in the same way, which I think matters for sort of building.
Right.
That with a year of advocacy and education and work, I think there's room to grow. So that's one thing that I was actually quite struck by in terms of the immediate aftermath of the introduction. The others in the media, I think, was pretty bought in. You saw a lot of favorable coverage from the New York Times, from the Daily News, from the Post even, not so much from Newsday on Long Island, but I think that there was a sense among not politicians that this was long overdue. So again, I think that this is a conversation that's really just starting in New York compared to other places. And I'm not so upset about where that conversation is for the amount of time it's been going on.
Yeah, it did feel a bit like the position taking in the legislature among electeds is lagging behind some of the popular or media discourse, in the sense that supporters in the legislature seem quite timid or quiet, while opponents were still more than willing to vocally come out against this plan. Suburban representatives raised a number of objections about character of their communities being changed, and that this plan would overcrowd schools or overload their roads and infrastructure. What did you make of those objections? Were any of them justified, or are they all sort of solvable problems?
The infrastructure stuff is certainly solvable, right? Like New York State is not the first place to consider building additional housing units in this country. And if there's really an insoluble infrastructure problem, people won't build, right? Like if you've got a site that just can't support it, no developers can build there, right? No one wants to live in a place that doesn't have water. That I think is nonsense, right? Like overcrowding schools is basically nonsense, right? Like the solution to that is you build another school, and that's something that happens in this country everywhere, all the time, in places that are growing. New York hasn't grown in a long time. These suburbs have not grown in a long time. I get that those muscles are not in shape, but these are problems to be solved if you want them to be solved. Character of the area, what can you say? I mean, if your definition of the area is we only have single family homes, we don't let in any multifamily housing, we certainly don't let in affordable housing, and you know, the walls that we put up are the part of the character that we really care about, then like, yeah, I guess so. It is going to change that character. I don't see that as a character really worth defending. For what it's worth, I think that's, this is the kind of thing where people get really worried ahead of time, and then you go back 5 years after any of these things are built, and people rarely care whatsoever, right? I mean, the number of places in New York State, in the downstate region, that have historic, you know, sort of districts around transit, that have multifamily scattered in among single family from sort of before zoning really got going, you know, because these are places that, especially in Westchester, really did develop prior to the creation of zoning along the railroad. It's fine. It's totally fine, right? I think if we think about a lot of our favorite sort of suburban neighborhoods before we get to our favorite urban neighborhoods, and you actually spend some time walking around, you're going to see, oh yeah, there's a duplex. Like that's fine. That's normal. I mean, maybe I'm overly optimistic about this because I grew up in a place that was, you know, on the one hand pretty suburban, on the other chock full of duplexes. That's what I grew up in. It was a duplex. But like it's just fine.
Yes. So aside from the objections coming out of the suburbs, there was also some amount of skepticism coming from the left to Hochul's plan. Could you talk about those concerns? You know, what were those objections, and you know, how should we think about those?
So in other states, this has been a bigger obstacle where there's a set of folks on the left who think that either this is a giveaway to large developers, or that it's going to, the new development is going to cause fuel gentrification or displacement. I think that the empirical bases for those concerns are not especially strong, but context really does matter. There's going to be different answers in different places, but the empirical bases on average are not so good. But we heard some of that in New York, but not as much. Distinctly less, I would say. Leading progressive groups like the Working Families Party were pretty strongly in support of Hochul's housing compact. You know, I think that there was skepticism among some on the further ends of the left who are just, you know, a liberalization of markets as a policy solution isn't their native tongue. But that wasn't what killed this deal.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing because it would serve progressive ends. So I think it's something that needs to be, it's coalitions that need to be maintained. It's relationships that are not necessarily easy, right? Everyone's got their lane and you're building coalitions across lanes. But I see that as a strength for New York, that those relationships were formed early, and people, maybe they're speaking in translation with each other, but are speaking with each other.
Yeah, it seemed like also that the progressives in New York, they have a priority of securing more tenant protections like good cause eviction at the state level, and perhaps we're hoping to package that with expanding housing supply.
That's certainly true, and that's sort of what I mean about two different lanes, and you know, it's not a bad thing for different advocacy groups and different parts of a political coalition to have their own priorities.
Yeah.
How you sort of strike those deals in Albany is a question for someone who's in Albany, which is not me. But that's the work of politics.
Right. And so hopefully that type of political deal remains possible going forward. So other states, as we spoke about, have been able to do housing compact style reforms and overcome suburban resistance or other objections, but not New York. So I'm just curious, like, why do you think New York is different here? Why is this so particularly hard for New York to get right?
Yeah, so I think there are two main answers to this. One is just, this isn't an issue that Albany has considered in 50 years. It's literally not been on the agenda prior to, say, 2 years ago, right? There were no bills, not no meaningful bills, like no bills by a backbencher, no bills introduced just to die, right? If you went and talked to Albany legislators about this 3 years ago, they did not know what you were talking about, much less why they shouldn't care. And that's not a knock on them, right? No one was asking them to care. They're busy, they've got to deal with literally every issue imaginable. So you're starting from zero. Massachusetts, California, Connecticut, right? These are states that have some strong policies, some weak policies on the book, but they've got policies on the book that the legislature is asked to tinker with, that agencies are asked to administer. They have experts embedded in state government in those agencies, and they're just able to start the conversation at a fundamentally different place. There was a hearing maybe 2 years ago about accessory dwelling units held by the New York State Assembly. I remember being there, and it just was very clear that some of the members thought, oh, we're talking about public housing or subsidized housing in some way, because that's what they do in the housing committee of the Assembly. So there's just a ton of education that needs to happen, a ton of building up that expertise within the legislature, building up that expertise within the state agencies where there could be trusted voices. HCR doesn't do this either, though they've gotten up to speed for this proposal. But so that's one big reason, is having even something that is completely ineffective means you've got familiarity with the issues. The other is that the New York City is really big. It's really big compared to any other city, and it's really big as a percentage of its metro area, especially if you exclude the New Jersey suburbs. So the balance of sort of New York City to New York City in-state suburbs is very off compared to other places that have dealt with this. And that means that the city has a life of its own politically. And there's so much housing stuff to do within that huge place, right? New York City has by far the most public housing. NYCHA certainly has a lot of issues that have to be dealt with. There's incredibly important land use questions, both involving affordability and not involving affordability, right? There's questions about rent stabilization that take up a huge amount of energy, rightly. And so you've got a whole world of things to do about housing that are within city limits, not in Albany, or are in Albany, but about New York City specifically, about this whole set of other issues. And so there's like a gravitational pull that is different. Whereas if you're in a Massachusetts, like, what are the suburbs' obligations on housing is just a more natural extension of the conversations they're already having. You couldn't plausibly have we're going to do it all within Boston policy, because Boston isn't big enough. You can plausibly have let's just talk about what to do in New York City policy conversation, and that's filled an agenda for many, many years, rightly and wrongly.
Mm-hmm. One particular source of strife in New York with the housing compact proposal seemed to be the prospect or the component of the plan where the state might come in and override local zoning in places that failed to meet those housing targets, the 1% to 3% housing goals for new construction. given that kind of seemed to stoke so much ire, is this from a policy perspective, is that type of mandate, that enforcement mechanism, an essential backstop, or is there any effective alternative to this stick that might have made the package a little easier to swallow in some quarters?
Yeah, you need some kind of stick. Would that it weren't so, right? Like there are many areas where carrots work well, but evidence and experience really very strongly indicates that this is not one of them. Right, so there have been pretty strong incentive programs created in states like Massachusetts and Connecticut, where they've built things like 12 units of housing, right, or 2 town. These are in Connecticut, like 2 town. I'm not sure if it's 12. There's 12 or 22 or 30. It was one of those numbers in 2 towns, and no one else took the money because rich suburbs, the places that are most exclusionary, don't need them. They have money. What they want is to maintain their existing built environment. And these are not like, oh, we'll give you, $1,000 here and there. They're like, we'll give you money for every housing permit you grant. We'll give you money for the rezoning. We'll give you money for the planning process. They're pretty strong incentives. Advocates and legislators in those states have fully agreed. They just didn't work, and it's time to move on, right? Massachusetts passed more than Connecticut has, but no one is saying in either state, let's just tinker with the incentives. This is getting us anywhere. There's any juice. There's no juice there. The one place it does work, there's 2 places that sort of the carrots are important. One is we saw places taking in Massachusetts what they call gateway cities, which are sort of the post-industrial cities, not closest into Boston, but maybe in half an hour or an hour outside the city. Places like Lawrence or Lowell, Brockton, if you're familiar with Massachusetts. These are places that actually do want to start building again, right? Because they faced a lot of disinvestment, deindustrialization, white flight, but they don't have the capacity to do it in-house because they've got a lot of other needs and not a lot of money. So that's a place where money can really be helpful, is in cities like that. The other place is you do need some technical assistance to just make this all work. You're asking places to change what they've been doing for a very long time, and they're not set up to change. So some amount of money to just sort of grease the wheels when you've actually started the process of change is very useful. It's not saying that the carrots or the money isn't important or the incentives, but they're not going to convince anyone to do anything they don't want to do. That's not a truth about the world ex ante, but it turns out to be a truth about the land use context.
Yeah, I think I saw that there were some electeds in New York City suburbs that said that they would turn down the money if there were incentives offered to build new houses.
There was a great article by Sam Mellons, who's been doing terrific reporting on this, and he just got them all on the record. It was terrific.
I think Sam is in the audience.
Oh, even better.
So we'll turn to audience questions in a minute. So do drop those in the chat or the Q&A for Noah to answer. But I did want to talk a bit about what might come next. So it seems like the housing compact in its initial form has failed, but seems very unlikely that it will wind up in the final budget that the state government is still negotiating as we speak. But are there any prospects that you see for something like the housing compact to be revived in the near future in New York?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't think of any state. Is that true? No, that's not true. Most states, and most of the big states that have passed anything on this, did not do it in their first try. That's just not the way the politics has worked. The exceptions are pretty small states where there's been bipartisan consensus. That's not the New York story, but it's also not the California story or the Massachusetts story. Right, or the New Jersey story, right? That's not a reasonable expectation. And what we do see is that either in the first time you pass nothing, you try on the same bill 4 times, and in year 5, the stars align, someone has changed seats, something has happened, there's a newspaper article that gets things going, and something that seemed totally dead suddenly just passes quickly and easily. That happened in Massachusetts. Another is that, okay, you start to pull it apart for parts, right? So we can't pass the whole thing, but we can pass this in 1 year, and we'll pass that in the next year, and we'll pass the third thing in the third year, and then year 4 will go back and fix all the things that didn't work in the first one, because none of these actually work the first time around. The thing is, local governments they're on the ground and the state isn't. They know all the loopholes, they know all the players, they know all the parcels. If they want to obstruct things, they can probably find a way to do it. They can find those loopholes. And so you need to be able to go back and close those loopholes in real time. So even if you passed it all in year 1, you're not actually getting units out of that passage, right? So it's about building. And I think there's a lot to be optimistic in the way this fight went down. There's allies to add, coalitions to build, education and persuasion to be done, but given that if you went back 3 years, there were no bills to even die, there were no advocacy organizations dedicated to this issue working in Albany. Those have both changed in important ways. Like, are we on track? Kind of. I think maybe, right? Like, you can always do better and faster, but I'm not pessimistic.
Yeah, I've done some work around healthcare reform, and I see a lot of parallels between the debates here and there, where there's a lot of consternation about disrupting the status quo and concern about private entities, private companies being responsible to produce and deliver essentially public essential goods. And yeah, that had to fail a few times before the Affordable Care Act passed, and there was the infrastructure in place and the awareness among policymakers around the solutions that were needed and the urgency of it before the conditions were right for it to work. So yeah, hopefully zoning and housing is on the same track. I did want to ask, though, if you were advising housing advocates in New York, how would you recommend that they regroup from this? What type of policy proposals do you think they should come back with, at least to start, at least to make progress?
Yeah, great question. I kind of think that the next round should include movements in two opposite directions, something that's stronger than the compact and something that's weaker than the compact. And what I mean by that is the compact was this comprehensive proposal, but like I said, it gave local governments the keys to the car. They got to hold the pen in the first instance. So I think one thing to do would be to take some best practices from other places and remind or introduce the concept to Albany legislators that the compact was fairly moderate. Right, so say, we're not going to give you the pen. We're just going to tell you what zoning is reasonable. There's nothing wrong with duplexes. Allow them. On big streets, you can allow apartments. We're just going to do that. We're going to allow, the actual housing we want to build. And I think that sort of having that pole of the debate would be important. And then you also want to be introducing some things that are more modern. And some of these bills already exist. Things like accessory dwelling units that might be a first step towards understanding that the state can step in and that local control here isn't sacrosanct. Changes on nitty-gritty stuff that isn't going to attract a lot of attention, just procedural stuff. Get the practicing land use lawyers from Westchester County in a room and ask them, what are 3 things no one's going to notice that we could change? I think that all of that is you want bills that can pass and build momentum as you start to build up for the next comprehensive one. But I think these are all things that are probably happening. I'm not going to tell anyone things they don't know, but I was struck by the housing compact being both comprehensive and moderate, and that being sort of a confusing place for the discourse to land. Right? Like, is this huge or is this weak? In some ways one and in some ways the other, and that is hard to impossible to capture for the media. And so getting like the full spectrum of policies out on the table, I think it would be a helpful thing to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you think about hiving off the part of the compact that was promoting housing near transit, near the Metro North and near the Long Island Railroad? Is that a logical first place to start? Like just begin with that piece and build up more housing along train lines?
So I think so. I think that if you're trying to build on New York's strengths and particular built environment, right, the transit system is the thing that really differentiates the New York suburbs from anywhere else. The state has put billions of dollars into the Long Island Railroad, for instance, and we should let people live near it and use those benefits. But my understanding is, oh, I'm going to get this right. I think the state Senate was more interested in the targets and was very against the TOD. And the Assembly was the other way around, though they didn't like anything. But I could have it backwards. So in some sense, like, I don't know, ask the people who get to vote on it, not me. But from a policy perspective, I do think that the 3% growth is a good goal, but not one that optimizes on New York's particular strengths, whereas TOD really is the thing that New York could do better than anyone else in the country.
And this wasn't part of the housing compact proposal, but in the interest of trying to build coalitions, some on the left are big proponents of social housing. Do you see that playing a role in future proposals?
I don't know. It is certainly the case that any proposal for social housing is going to need to do land use reform, because most of the models would just be illegal to build in much of the region, or at least easy for locals to add costs to and delay and cripple that way. So yes, I think there are some clear synergies there. The hesitation in my voice is that one thing that's possibly appealing about land use reform is that it's free, whereas social housing it's not. So depending on the budget politics of the moment, they can be really good complements, or they can be more substitutes. And again, I think that's sort of a, like, what's going on in Albany that year in some hypothetical future that it's hard for anyone to know.
Right. Yeah, it does. I hear you, because it both social housing and private development are going to require land use reform, but social housing is also probably going to require tax increases or spending cuts elsewhere. So it does feel like that is actually politically more difficult between the two. That's a good point. We've got like 6 minutes left. So if anyone has questions, do start sending those in now. But Noah, I also wanted to ask you that, so housing is traditionally a state and local issue, but is there a role for the federal government to step in here when localities are refusing to build up their housing stock?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so one place that, is an important one to look at is the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act, which is not the world's as enforced and especially strong. It's more of a procedural planning mechanism, but one of the things that it can do is really cast a spotlight and ask local governments to justify why they have exclusionary policies. The comment period on the Biden administration's restoration of that rule just closed like this week, I think. So we'll see what they come up with, but I think that's one place that if the rule is actually allowed to get going, which it wasn't in its first iteration at the very tail end of the Obama administration, is a place the federal government can step in. There's a lot of legislation that's being introduced on a really bipartisan basis to think about how to either incentivize land use reforms or get information out there or use federal funding in better ways that helps promote land use reform. So I think this is a place where the federal government is going to be getting involved in the years to come. I think that it really crosses partisan issues at moments of gridlock. It's a place where I think the federal government may end up turning. We'll see if the politics are ever right, but I think we're going to get stuff.
We have a question in the Q&A saying, I read that landlords are planning to take rent stabilization to the Supreme Court. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, I believe they filed cert from the Second Circuit, but so it's up to the Supreme Court, but I could be wrong, that they've actually filed. I don't know enough about the procedure. But yes, there's ongoing litigation. The Second Circuit upheld rent stabilization, so that is the status quo, is that it has been legal. Changes to the rent stabilization laws give landlords an opportunity to say maybe these changes pushed it over the line. Second Circuit said they didn't. The Supreme Court either could say yes they did, or we've made other changes to the relevant law, especially takings law, and now we're going to undo other pieces of our precedent, which obviously they've been willing to do of late. So we'll see what happens, I suppose.
We'll have to pay attention to that case. One thing we haven't talked about that's maybe kind of been implicitly in this conversation is homelessness. Are there other types of housing reforms that are needed that would be most effective to alleviate the inhumane levels of homelessness in New York? Do we need to legalize different types of housing beyond what had been contemplated in the compact?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So I think there's two ways that land use reform effective. One is sort of, if you can alleviate the overall market pressure, you can reduce the flow of people into homelessness. And that's something that overall supply type reforms can do quite well. And there is some empirical work really finding a connection between how tight zoning is to housing costs, to homelessness, right? So it's really on the into homelessness piece of things. But it's not a compelling answer or a good one to say to someone who's actually homeless, we're going to take down market rents by 5% and your problems are solved. It's not how markets work, and no amount of zoning reform is going to create the kind of like deeply affordable levels that are necessary for housing market for certain individuals and certain households. So I do think that legalizing more types of housing is one more piece of that, though the subsidy piece and the services pieces are always going to be important. But there's a lot of reason to think that one of the things that has made homelessness that much worse is the elimination of things like single room occupancy housing, which served as the bottom rung of sort of the housing ladder. Not the place most people wanted to be, though it was actually quite good for some individuals. But when we got rid of this sort of major tier of housing, lowest cost housing, some people were able to move up into higher quality housing, and some people moved down into not having housing at all. That's people talk about sort of the creation of homelessness in the 1970s, and that's one of the factors that turned street homelessness in particular into something that existed where it largely had not before. So this is something that New York City has been sort of grappling with for decades and kind of spinning its wheels on. But I think there's a widely shared sense that this is something that has to happen, but it's a really sticky, complicated set of problems. There's so many provisions that were created to get rid of this kind of housing in building codes and zoning codes, and many of those are really important health and safety purposes. How you figure out what the sort of new model is both hard from a policy perspective and then super hard from a political perspective.
Well, there's plenty more we could discuss, but we are at time. I wanted to thank everyone joining today. Thank you, Noah, for answering all of our questions and sharing your wealth of expertise with us. Stay tuned for more programs and events coming from the ACS New York Lawyer Chapter. We're actually doing an event next week, a week from today, specifically on climate, which we touched on briefly today, because there are climate and environmental implications from how we build housing. But go to our website, go to acslaw.org, make sure you're signed up for our emails. You can register for the climate event and our other events there. We're also on Facebook, so you can follow us there. But thank you so much for joining in and for the conversation. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.